that fallen tree in the path. That's not a cinematic idea. That's practical medieval thinking. The marshes, the worst place to live and the best place to hide. If forests were dangerous, marshlands were worse. In eastern England, the fens were once a vast landscape of wet ground, shallow water, and shifting channels. Traveling through it on horseback was nearly impossible. Even walking could kill you. And yet outlaws hid there because law enforcement struggled to follow. The Normans, famous for cavalry, were nearly useless in mud. Some rebels became legends in these environments, not because they were heroic, but because the landscape itself protected them. The marsh became a fortress, but living there meant constant damp, cold nights, insects, disease, rotting clothes, no clean firewood, no stable shelter. You weren't living a free life. You were living a slow death. Caves, crags, and abandoned mines. Some outlaws didn't hide in forests or marshes. They hid in places the ordinary person avoided. Records mention men hiding in caves and rocky terrain, landscapes filled with natural shelter, but also filled with fear. And then there's one of the most unsettling hiding places of all. Abandoned mines, old lead mines, quarries, and secret shafts. Think about the logic. They're hidden. They're hard to access. They're cold but sheltered. And if you know the tunnels, you can vanish instantly. To the medieval mind, these weren't just hiding places. They were underworld spaces, places where criminals became ghosts. The Black Death changed everything. Then came the plague. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it rearranged society. Whole villages were abandoned, farms collapsed, fields became empty, houses stood unused, and that created something medieval. England had rarely seen before, large areas of usable shelter with no one guarding it. For outlaws, this was an opportunity. A deserted village meant intact buildings, wells for water, leftover tools, fruit trees and gardens, barns and storage rooms, a ready-made hideout. And if you were desperate enough, you could survive there for months. But the danger was constant, because abandoned places attract attention, not only from lawmen, but from other desperate people. Outlaws didn't always live alone. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Some outlaws weren't truly isolated. They had networks, family, friends, villages that quietly supported them, not because villagers loved crime, but because medieval justice was often brutal, biased, and expensive. Sometimes an outlaw wasn't seen as a villain. He was seen as a man who had been crushed by the system. And some communities chose to protect him. Records describe villages fined or punished for harboring known outlaw gangs. This tells us something important. Outlawry could make you illegal, but not necessarily socially rejected. The law called you a criminal. Your people might call you one of their own. The reality of winter. And now we need to talk about winter, because winter destroys the fantasy instantly. A medieval outlaw didn't have modern clothing, waterproof gear, antibiotics, or stable shelter. If you got wet, you stayed wet. If you got injured, infection was likely. If you caught a fever, you could die in days. Food became scarce. Firewood became harder to gather without being noticed. And if you stayed in one place too long, someone would eventually talk. The cold wasn't just discomfort, it was a predator. Most outlaws didn't live long enough to become legends. They died young, quietly, in places no one wrote songs about. So, why did the merry outlaw myth exist? Because the myth was useful. Even medieval people understood the fantasy. There are early medieval Robin Hood stories that already present the outlaw as an almost mythical figure, living in the woods, eating like a noble, humiliating the powerful, and that imagery wasn't accidental. In a society where most people lived under strict hierarchy, the idea of a man outside that system, answering to no lord, no tax collector, no judge, was intoxicating. The outlaw became a symbol, not of crime, but of escape. Even if the real outlaw life was filthy, hungry, and short. The myth didn't need to be true, it only needed to be satisfying. The brutal truth: outlawry was a slow execution. So, if we strip away the romance, what do we have left? A medieval outlaw wasn't a rebel hero. He was a person whose legal identity had been removed. A man forced into hiding because the alternative was imprisonment, mutilation, or death. He didn't flee into the forest because it was beautiful. He fled because it was the only place where the law struggled to follow. And he survived not through freedom, but through fear, violence, secrecy, and the willingness of others to break the law with him. And if he was lucky, he survived long enough to disappear. Not into legend, but into the silence of history. Because for every Robin Hood, there were thousands of nameless men who became outlaws and were swallowed by the medieval world. No songs, no heroic speeches, just hunger, cold, and the knowledge that if anyone recognized your face, you were already dead. And for a closing thought, that fallen tree in the forest, it's still there, and it's still a perfect place for an ambush, because the landscape hasn't changed as much as we think. But what has changed is this. Today, we imagine the outlaw as a symbol of freedom. In the Middle Ages, an outlaw was something else entirely, a person the law had abandoned. And once you were outside the king's peace, the world didn't need to chase you forever. It only needed to wait. Because sooner or later, the cold, the hunger, or betrayal would finish the job.